Previously, we established the fundamental principles of Dugin's geopolitical eschatology, while noting in passing its crypto-evolutionary character. Before we proceed to the exposition of outlines of the concrete plan for creating the Eurasian Empire, the empire, quote unquote, made of many empires, as Dugin would have it, we'll first have to expound on this point some more in order to provide a clear insight into the method by which Dugin constructs the concrete map of the Eurasian world order of his dreams. The geopolitics evolves as its subject evolves. We've already seen how Dugin portrays the development of primordial land-sea conflict from the ancient world down to its final fulfillment and totality in the global, or at least globalizing world. This means that if we are to understand the laws of geopolitics, we have to contemplate their historical genesis, because, save for the fundamental principle of bipolar conflict, all of those laws, quote unquote laws, by their very nature evolve as the inevitable final conflict is getting near. As we already noted, in the somewhat different context, this is a quite Hegelian notion of quote unquote system of sciences, which includes both knowledge of object and the subject as they create one unified reality through their interactions. It is the unfolding of an absolute, if essentially self-contradictory, idea, devouring everything in its path, from religion and culture to concrete individual persons, and especially them, and then dissolving it all into an absolute system of geopolitical world empire that has to be constructed consciously, which was hitherto not the case with the empires of previous times. In this sense, Dugin's Geopolitics provides the notion of ideology with a new meaning. By basing everything on conflict as an absolute idea, he constructed an absolute ideology of conflict. And, as we shall see in the following, if this monstrosity should ever come to pass in historical reality, its anthem would surely have at least one verse saying something along the lines of "Big is beautiful." In the Foundations of Geopolitics, Dugin provides a detailed history of the genesis of geopolitics as a science, from the quote-unquote founding fathers to contemporary theories, i.e., those from the second half of 20th century. Now we'll proceed to extract the original notions that stand at the foundations of Neo-Eurasian empire building program he took from his predecessors. One of the main problems for Dugin is to establish the reason why the Russians are destined to lead a world empire and, in more general terms, why the empires are necessary at all. To be sure, we won't see him cringe much about it. Yet, throughout the foundations of geopolitics, attentive reader can't overlook this problem. The absolute ideology requires absolute foundation, which is, after all, the very purpose of Dugin's book. But awkwardly enough, it doesn't seem to quote unquote organically pop up before the reader's eyes as something self-evident, or at least demonstrated by the musings of its author. Although we are treated with the standard third Rome fare somewhere along the way, in the midst of the book that is, and with numerous declarations of the quote-unquote messianic character of Russian people, which fit neatly into the Neo-Eurasian system, provided we allow ourselves to get entangled into its ideological net, when everything makes sense in the head of the infected Duginoid anyway, there is no clear answer as to why would all this reflect the eternal and all-encompassing truth. To an extent, Dugin already answered this question when he squarely placed the exercise of geopolitics in the sphere of the will and imagination of the elites. This more or less settles the matter for him, because the whole point is not the truth, but the empire building. Yet, as all good sons of modernity, he needs the founding myth in the scientific garb to make the whole thing intellectually coherent and smoothly ticking. On the one hand, his quote-unquote myth of origins of the world conflict and its nature is founded on a peculiar occultist teaching, laid out at the very end of Foundations of Geopolitics, but elaborated more thoroughly earlier in his books Hyperborean Revelation and Conspirology. This aspect of Neo-Eurasianism we'll treat separately in an addendum to the present analysis. On the other hand, however, there is a far less picturesque yet fairly familiar modern thought model he employs: Darwinism. When writing about Friedrich Rätzel, a student of the famous German Darwinian Ernest Haeckel and the founder of German Geopolitik, Dugin is quite unequivocal about his foundational significance in the evolution of geopolitics. Quote, Rätzel demonstrates that soil is the fundamental, immutable given around which the interest of the people revolves. The flow of history is being conditioned by soil and territory. From Rätzel's organicist approach, it is clear that he understands the spatial expansion as natural process of life, analogous to the life of living organism. Rätzel's organicist approach manifests itself in relation to space, in German Raum. The space is shifting from quantitative material category into the new quality, becoming the sphere of life, the living space Lebensraum. Hence follow two other important Rätzel's notions: the meaning of space, Raumsinn, and life energy, Lebensenergie. All these theses represent the fundamental principles of geopolitics. Moreover, the state understood as the living spatial organism rooted in soil is the main thought and the focal point of the geopolitical method. Unquote. Dugin takes Rätzel's notions as the nucleus out of which the geopolitics evolved into full system during the 100-odd years of its history. It is essential to stress once again that he is unequivocal about this, equivocation otherwise being his trademark. The fundamental geopolitical subject is the expanding collective organism founded in the soil, i.e., circumscribed into individuality by geographical vectors. This is its Lebensraum, circumscribed by its own peculiar Raumsinn. In this sense, a quite unequivocal form of Darwinism is deeply seated at the foundation of Dugin's project, although obscured by fanciful occultist theories and extreme Russian Orthodox philhetism thrown in for good measure. This is not only because the founding father of Geopolitik was accidentally the student of one of the most prominent German Darwin's zealots, but also because the foundation of the subject of geopolitics, the one that makes it an apocalyptic theology, must be expansive by its nature. Rätzel's answer to a Darwinist riddle, i.e., bridging the gap between biology and everything else, is, of course, the analogy. A strictly non-empirical method beloved by extreme empiricists when they start losing it. And Dugin accepts it wholeheartedly. The fact that it is not really applicable as a means of scientific demonstration in the modern sense of the word doesn't bother him, as it didn't bother any Darwinist luminary from the Charles Darwin himself to our own day and age. Because the purpose is the creation of theology of the below, absolute deification of the lowest common denominator, where its spontaneous evolution transmutes quote unquote quantitative material category into the new quality. To anyone in the know, it is also obvious, just to make a digression, why Dugin says that one should read René Guénon as Karl Marx. The quantity giving birth to quality or mass acting upon itself and giving birth to individuality is the foundational principle of dialectical materialism. What is most important, the authentic living spatial organism has to expand. And the main problem of geopolitics then becomes the answer to a question: where does this expansion end? Well, it depends on what individuum we are exactly talking about. Is it a small amoeba that popped out of primordial slime at the wrong time and place, or the holy amoeba providentially excreted from the soil to synthesize holy bacteriological empire into existence with a carte blanche to assimilate everything in its way? After all, quote, the understanding of the state as a living organism presupposes the rejection of the notion of inviolability of the borders. Unquote. Oddly enough, Dugin praises Ratzel's discovery of the nature of the subject of geopolitics that took place in North America of all places. It is interesting that Ratzel, quote, noted that the Raumsinn of Americans is developed to the greatest extent because they were confronted with the task of conquering the empty spaces and were in possession of the considerable politico-geographical experience of European history. Therefore, Americans consciously realized that the Old World was building only intuitively and by degrees. In this way, we find in Ratzel the first formulations of the second most important geopolitical concept, the notion of world power, Weltmacht. Ratzel noticed that development of big countries displays the urge to increase the geographical expansion that gradually reaches the planetary level. Hence, sooner or later, geographical development has to reach its continental phase. Unquote. It is obvious how the notions at the foundations of geopolitics organically evolve and pulsate as one body. Raumsinn of the great people necessitates the expansion of its Lebensraum to continental and, natural selection willing, global Lebensraum, which in turn calls for becoming a Weltmacht. It is also obvious how crude mind can get ensnared into this mentality simply by following apparently necessary, the word is organic, nexus, binding everything together and, dazed by Dugin's illusionism, dub it even an integral traditionalism or a resurgence of Christianity through Christ-bearing people, while it is essentially anything but. The reason for this is intellectual coherence of ideology, not an accurate reflection of the truth. A creation of ideological magic mirror which reflects to everyone precisely what he wants to see, something that is apparently a trademark of capable geopolitician if we reflect upon the fact that Dugin's American counterpart, the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, was apt in pulling off the same trick in opposite guise. And we all know how much monkeys, or at least their descendants, love their own reflections in the mirror. Well, if Ratzel brought out the nucleus of geopolitics, it is only fitting that he anticipated the fundamental mitosis in this epistemological amoeba. Quote, in his book The Sea, Source of Power of the People, Ratzel pointed out the need of every powerful state to focus its attention to the development of the military navy because it is demanded by the planetary scope of the legitimate expansion. What some peoples and nations, England, Spain, Holland, etc., created spontaneously, the land-based nations have to do consciously. The development of the fleet is a necessary condition for reaching the status of the Weltmacht. The sea and superpower are already congenial for us, although only with the later geopoliticians, that is, Alfred Mechen, Halford Mackinder, Karl Haushofer, and especially Carl Schmitt, this subject will become the center of gravity. Ratzel's work is a necessary foundation of all geopolitical investigation. End quote. The formation of the ultimate form of land power's Lebensraum has to be brought about consciously, i.e., it has to be a definite program or strategic plan. The successful implementation of this plan would give expression to the fundamental geopolitical formation of big space, Grossraum. The concept was developed by German jurist Carl Schmitt, who in Dugin's eyes, along with Ratzel and Karl Haushofer, represents a decisive figure in the development of continental geopolitics, or Geopolitik in German, because it is mostly German or at least Nordic made. Quote, Schmitt developed a theory of the great space, Grossraum. This concept observes the process of development of the states as an urge to increase the territorial expanse. The principle of imperial integration represents the expression of logical and natural tendency towards synthesis, inherent to all human beings. In this sense, the periods of the state expansion correspond to the periods of human spirit's movement towards the universality. The development of the nomos of the land, nomos der Erde, has to lead to the emergence of the state continent. The emergence of the land-based state continent, a continental Grossraum, is a historical and geopolitical necessity. End quote. Nomos in Greek, the law. Nomos of the land signifies the disposition of the land-based state, as opposed to the nomos of the sea, which is the disposition of the seafaring nation. Both terms correspond to vague notion of Raumsinn, and are not to be understood as legal terms in the modern sense of the word, but as approximations to something that cannot be laid out in the formalized system, but is nevertheless objectively binding. How then, one might ask, do we know when some Grossraum building neighbor comes knocking on a door, does Nomos der Erde he invokes really oblige us to let him in without going for the gun? Why, that's easy. Quote, Schmitt affirmed that the creation of the new big space does not depend on scientific value of some doctrine, cultural excellence, economical development of its constituents, or even the territorial or ethnic center which provided the first impulse for integration. Everything depends solely on the political will, recognizing the historical necessity from where, I wonder, of such geopolitical step. With this doctrine, Schmitt had foreseen the foundation of contemporary politics of integration. Unquote. So we are provided with all the Lego cubes needed to construct the invisible empire for all family. It is a global expansion of several integrated big spaces, that is empires, built around the continental axis of Eurasian landmass, fulfilling the Raumsinn of the land-based civilization and winning the geopolitical Endkampf by transforming entire Earth into ideocratic global empire, rectifying and thus fulfilling the wayward but geopolitically correct plan of the planet quote unquote planetary rule of the Third Reich. The foundational cube that is supposed to make the whole construction stick is the fact that this time its center cannot be Germany or any other nation state, but the axis of the land-based empires led by Russia, an empire of the end, or Berlin-Moscow-Tokyo geopolitical axis. Excuse me. Uh, the subject of geopolitics is the Russian people, not the Russian state or the Russian culture. All foundational concepts we laid out beforehand serve only to make this fact clear. This means that Russians for Dugin, as we pointed out in the first part of this analysis, are messianic people, destined to bring about the gathering of the empire. In quotes, gathering of the empire is a Dugin's technical term. In this sense, Dugin is neither a Russian nationalist nor even imperialist in the sense of rejuvenating the Russian Empire. In his eyes, Russians are the people of the world empire because they are not the subject of nation but of the quote unquote universalist civilization, i.e., the civilization that is capable to bring about the empire of the end. Quote, Russian people had moved step by step towards this goal. At each phase of their national expansion, they were reaching another level of messianic universalism. First by uniting East Slavs, then incorporating Turco-Tatar flood from the Siberian steppe, then moving towards south into deserts and mountains, and finally they ended up creating a giant political bloc that in Soviet times controlled literally half of the world. If we realize that Russian people is in its essence precisely a representation of this empire building process, a decisive vector of creating the state of the absolute idea, then it will also become clear that the existence of Russian people depends on continuing this process. If we limit or suppress that vector, we'll hit the Russians into their very heart. Deny them of national identity, transform them in the historical rudiment, and will ruin the global teleological, eschatological, planetary process. Unquote. Dugin considers Russians to be a civilization building which is in his eyes convertible into empire building people. Moreover, the civilization that they are destined to build is a universal one in the very peculiar sense of the word, i.e., it is the expression of the Eurasian Raumsinn and the relation Russians have towards it. This quote unquote meaning of the Russian space consists in the fact that the Russian Grossraum cannot be contained and must encompass the whole world, in analogy to how Russians throughout history assimilated various peoples into their dominion. Quote, namely, uniqueness of Russian nationalism lies precisely in its global character. It is not so much related to blood, but to the space, soil, and land. Russians will lose their identity and vanish as a nation outside of the empire. Unquote. We must stress, as Dugin himself does on numerous occasions, that this is not nationalism in the sense of the concept of Greater Russia, yet, and somewhat to the contrary, it is the globalism of global Russia. Therefore, when Dugin's defenders point out that he is not really a nationalist, they fail to see, usually deliberately, that he only mutated into something far greater. He is not a small-time chauvinist, not because he has qualms about chauvinism, but because he has qualms about being small-time. His chauvinism is merely, quite literally, of cosmic proportions, and is capable, indeed it is compelled, to welcome and absorb all other chauvinisms. And you can't pull something like this off by forbidding your partners to wave their own imperial flags. Eurasian Empire is meant to be an empire of empires, the global empire encompassing power blocks, or Grossraumen, not sovereign nation states or indeed any political formation that is not steered by the geopolitical universalism of the land power. For this reason, Dugin is always open to support any kind of nationalism provided it is expansive, because in his eyes this is only the natural process of creating big spaces that is essentially teleological and will inevitably lead to creation of the rejuvenation of Axis powers, which this time around won't lose the world war. The only essential thing is that Russia does not lose its imperial destiny. Quote, now, after the fall of Soviet Union, the West is trying to impose a different geopolitical function on Russia to turn it into political structure incapable of direct participation in international politics and fulfillment of its civilization building mission. Russia is being offered the role of regional state. The regional state has greater political ambitions than the common state, but it always remains less than a superpower or the empire. It can have that. At the same time, a regional state has a certain freedom towards its immediate, that is weaker, neighbors, and can always exercise political and economical pressure upon them. For Russia, becoming a regional state would mean a renunciation of the deepest national impulse which is at the foundation of its deepest identity. Unquote. This would be, one might add, the image of Russia projected by RT et al. And approved more or less by their Western audiences in its right to exercise pressure on its neighbors and thus provide media consumers sitting on their couches far away from the zones of conflict with a sense of realpolitik getting back on the world scene. However, as most of the imbeciles among this demographic don't have a clue about what it means to be quote unquote under geopolitical pressure and how being big does not at the same time mean being morally justified, this sense of reality provided by Russian self-image projected in the West is rather a fragile one, almost as fragile as puffed up egos of those who fall for it. Dugin rejects the notion of regional state, even as a transitional phase in the empire-building process. Russia must be squarely on its way to create the empire, and being a regional state can perhaps only be used as a ruse, while the continuity of the process has to be maintained. However, the real and legitimate, albeit unfulfilled expression and premonition of Eurasian empire is to be found in the Soviet Union. Quote, it is impossible to deny the fact that the axis of the Soviet Empire was precisely the Russian people that realized, albeit only partially, its unique universalism through Soviet ideological and socio-political model. End quote. This short passage can provide us with some glimpses of what exactly this quote-unquote unique universalism is and what it does to those who are being universalized by it, bearing in mind that Dugin seeks something far more radical than Soviet model. And if there is still some uncertainty as to why the Russians and why the Russia, Dugin explains it quite succinctly. Quote, the new empire has to be built as an empire right now. This process cannot be laid aside for some future perspective, while hoping for better circumstances in the future. The mere state practically never developed into empire. The empires were built immediately as an expression of the unique civilization building will. Unquote. So it's all about decision of the sovereign, as Schmidt would have it, disregarding everything else except the decision that, quote, the existence of Russian people as an organic historical community is inconceivable without empire building, continental creativity. Russians will remain the people only in the framework of the new empire. This empire must, in accordance with the logic of geopolitics, strategically and spatially surpass its antecedent, Soviet Union. Therefore, the new empire has to be Eurasian, continental, in perspective, a world empire. The battle for global rule of the Russian people is not finished. Unquote. Ah, another quote. At the foundations of geopolitical construction of this, that is Eurasian empire, there must be laid a fundamental principle, the principle of common enemy. Unquote. The empire of the end is a strategic consolidation of the continental world, not a mere national expansion of the Russians. It is the multipolar phase of the final quite unipolar advent of the global rule of the Russian people. Quite similarly to Hobbes' idea of sovereignty coming to pass as a spark of reason popping out spontaneously from the chaos of bellum omnium contra omnes, war of everybody against everybody, that is. Eurasian empire is to be consolidated from the common enemy image of Feindbild in German, also Schmidt's term, of various great spaces, i.e., on the basis of total negativity, creating respective identities of the future empires subjected to the third row. All talk about preserving the cultural, ethnic, and religious identities Dugin frequently repeats in his books, articles, and lectures is to be observed exclusively from this point of view, because this plurality is tolerated only insofar as it is being formed out of the reaction to the threat of the sea power. As Dugin's geopolitics is an ideology of absolute conflict, all other unique features of peoples other than Russians would necessarily be discarded as inconvenient facts, distorting the perfect systems of the absolute idea. Truly, in his view, war is the father of all things, and in order to resolve the destiny of the earth, one needs a global war, a third world war. The Endkampf will be waged between USA-led sea power and the land power consolidated around the geopolitical axis. Lisbon to Vladivostok. The linchpin in this quote-unquote empire of empires destined to rectify the mistakes of Axis powers in the World War II would be an alliance of Russia and Central Europe, consolidated around Germany in its ideocratic, presumably Fourth Reich incarnation, free from the corruptive influence of maritime civilization. Quote, all strivings towards the European consolidation around Germany and Middle Europa will have a positive meaning only insofar they fulfill one fundamental condition, the creation of enduring geopolitical and strategic axis Moscow-Berlin. Moreover, it is hard to expect the genuine geopolitical and national awakening of Europe without revolutionary influence of the Russian factor. Unquote. So the alliance of Germany and Russia in their ideocratic incarnations, that is, Nazi and communist, or Bolshevik, better to say, the fulfillment of national Bolshevik dream from Nikitsch and Yoki to Dugin himself would lay in the reversal of Ribbentrop-Molotov into Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where Russia would play the leading role in detaching the Central Europe from the pesky Atlantean influence in all its forms. This consolidation, however, would require a sacrificial lamb. Quote, In the Eurasian project, England will inevitably become the sacrificial lamb because European process of continental integration will necessarily develop not only with utter disregard of British interests, but precisely contrary to them. In this context, no small role will be played by European and generally Eurasian support to Irish, Scottish and Welsh nationalism, all the way to inciting separatist initiatives and political destabilization of the Great Britain. Unquote. This sacrificial lamb role is neatly present in all three areas of the Eurasian axis, and it of course corresponds to countries designated by Dugin as formed on Atlanticist principles. So in Europe, the postmodern asymmetrical simulacrum of World War II will be decided by Germany-led Europe winning the Battle of Britain not only without repeating the fatal Hitler's mistake of simultaneously attacking the Russia, but waging it under the thumb of Russia. Shortly then, the postmodern Sieg will be accomplished to everybody's satisfaction. As the Eurasian East-West axis is meant to ensure the strategic consolidation of geographical space in collision with the sea power, and only that, it has to project the meridian vectors in order to create the buffer zones. Or geopolitical outposts in the direction of the south, while the north is already covered by the Russian landmass and relative inaccessibility of the cold seas. The north-south meridian cutting from Europe to Africa would in perspective come to be dominated by German Europe, and Africa would become an appendix to Europe. Quote, the European Empire, vitally interested into ever deeper trust to the south of African continent, must in perspective establish full control of Africa all the way to Sahara, relying on pan-Arab bloc, and in the future it must strategically penetrate the entire African continent. Unquote. The Middle East, however, is to have a large autonomy of relatively individual great space on the meridian axis of Moscow-Tehran. There too, as stakes are high because the south is the soft belly of Eurasia, we meet another sacrificial lamb. It is Turkey. Quote, it is also important to bear in mind the need of imposing the role of sacrificial lamb on Turkey, because the interests of this country in Caucasus and Middle Asia will not be considered at all. Moreover, the support should probably be given to Kurdish separatism in the mainland Turkey, as well as to the Turkish Armenians' calls for autonomy. End quote. The easternmost stretch of the Eurasian Empire will be controlled by Tokyo. Quote, at the first sight, China is a landmass and a civilization of traditional authoritarian character, and the very fact of it preserving the communist ideology throughout the liberal reforms should apparently contribute to the choice of China instead of capitalist insular Japan. However, history shows us that precisely China represents geopolitically the foremost beachhead of Anglo-Saxon forces of the Eurasian continent, while Japan supported the alliance with Central European countries of opposite outlook, that is, in tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. Only at the time of active Maoism did China display the original Eurasian striving, when it was motivated by projects of peasant socialism, greater Chinese nationalism, and pronounced Sovietophilia. Generally speaking, China fulfills all requirements of becoming the geopolitical sacrificial lamb in the course of realizing the Pan-Asian project. This can be accomplished by inciting the inner separatism in China, that is, Tibetans, Mongols, Muslims, Uyghurs probably, as well as by playing on the card of regional oppositions. Unquote. This passage, aside from pinpointing the sacrificial lamb, displays admirably a key aspect of Dugin's ideology. The traditionalist for him equals ideocratic, And what ideocratic really is becomes obvious. And accidentally, that's the term he took from Pyotr Savitsky, a Russian philosopher. Becomes obvious from him designated communism, most notably its Maoist form, to be precisely that. In this sense, he has no qualms about it being on the same level with Shia Islam and Russian Orthodoxy, as indeed with National Socialism and Bolshevism. The only essential thing is that it is opposed to, that is, negatively defined by, correspondingly simplified liberalism of the sea power. We will dwell on this some more later, but let us note in passing how Dugin's absolute ideology completely eradicates all qualitative differences between religions, cultures, and more or less everything else, submitting it all to the geopolitical imagination operating with absolutely simplistic quantitative operands of the land versus sea duality. This is the quote unquote absolute idea Dugin wants to see, absorbing everything else in one conscious swoop across the planet, creating the world detached from its cultural diversity, not by liberal eradication of the same, but by replacing it with ideologically driven simulacra of traditions, religions, cultures, etc. At the center of it all, however, remains the Russian people. Quote, in the framework of the empire, Russians won't gain their own nation state as an expression of ethnic community, but instead they'll achieve the national unity and the gigantic continental state in running of which they'll play the central role. Unquote. In order to accomplish this, Dugin needs one more ultimate sacrificial lamb. Quote, in due course, on the global level of the process of building the new planetary empire, the ultimate sacrificial lamb will be precisely USA, and undermining of its power, all down to total demolition of that geopolitical construction, will be methodically and uncompromisingly enacted by all participants in the new empire. Euro-ASEAN project presupposes Euro-ASEAN uh, expansion into South and Central Americas in order to release them from the influence of the North, as well as inciting all kinds of instability and separatism inside the USA borders. The forces of Afro-American racists could be relied upon in this respect. The ancient Roman formula "Carthage must be destroyed" will become the absolute slogan of the Eurasian Empire because it encompasses the essence of geopolitical planetary strategy of continent that is awakening to its mission. Unquote. Well, we can be sure that American white nationalist Dugin groupies would be able to find some excuse for him initially choosing the black racialists instead of them. After all, who would have figured in the 90s that the main neo-Eurasianist Anglophone outlets would be the American ones? But the simple fact is, he doesn't care for consistency outside of the consistency of his absolute ideology of conflict. All means are sanctified by the end of bringing about the Enkampf and the victory of Russia-led, rejuvenated Axis powers. The huge part of Foundations of Geopolitics has been devoted to details of the construction of the internal structure of the still invisible empire, and for the sake of brevity, will refrain from going in depth into it. Instead, we'll draw conclusions from the principles we outlined in this two-part analysis, and they are fairly sufficient to provide insight into the nature of this globalist project. Dugin is a special kind of ideologue, i.e., he's an absolute ideologue, or ideologue of absolute ideology. This means he's a system builder, both in philosophical and political sense, because every detail of the absolute idea has to be consciously made manifest in reality. To be more precise, it has to be imposed upon the world. This is blatantly obvious from his insistence that geopolitics is the matter of self-conscious elite and its ability to make sovereign decisions based on their imagination, not on the existence of some supposedly geopolitical laws. In fact, those laws are a compendium of all imperial strivings of the past, synthesized into one ideological melting pot of Neo-Eurasianism. Strangely enough, if only at the first sight, its ideological Atlanticist counterpart is at the same time its efficient cause. Land power mirrors the sea power perfectly. For example, Dugin recognizes the importance of trilateral commission. Quote, the trilateral commission formed by the members of the highest circles of American political establishment, as the new configuration of the planet presupposes strategic consolidation of three geopolitical zones. Three sides of this commission pretending to function as the world government are American, European, and Pacific one, that is, America, Europe, and Japan. End quote. This is Dugin's answer to it, to its existence. The Eurasia quote, the Eurasian project offers something precisely opposite to the plans of trilaterals. The new empire is an anti-trilateral. It is inverted, its inverted model. It is a consolidation of the three geopolitical zones centered in Russia and directed against America. Following the same logic by which the USA seeks to keep Europe and Japan under its geopolitical control, Russia must, in building the new empire in every conceivable way, strive to create the lasting strategic alliance with Europe and Japan. That is, in principle, we are talking about creating our own Eurasian Trilateral Commission. End quote, unquote. Of course, he is not talking alliance here means also strategic alliance is strategic control. Only Russian control must be a better thing. Everything this man is capable of doing is to invert something already existing into its polar opposite. It doesn't matter at all that Trilateral Commission is in all certainty precisely what he says it is. What matters is that he doesn't want to abolish it, evade it, or denounce it, but recreate it for himself. Implicitly, this means that Dugin considers all the vectors of Western globalism completely relevant and true. Only he wants to see the globalism in which his sides of the globe will run the world on inversion of the sea power principles. This is usually the gateway drug, leading Westerners deeper into chronic Duginitis. Most people take only his more or less correct observations about their part of the world in the context of Western globalization and consider him a sort of independent thinker denouncing globalization in general. But he is anything but. He is the proponent of different, inverted globalization, founded, among other things, on idea that the outcome of the World War II can be rectified and reversed, and the choice, of course, is either or. This is the hallmark of the world-class liar. The dialectical geometaphysics we covered on the previous pages is a complete and utter lie because it can be defined as a conscious creation of the world-encompassing illusion. It is as illusory and as coherent as dialectical materialism and liberal free market ideology Dugin compared it to, and the most importantly, it is a mirror image of what it supposedly fights. It has to be an illusion, because the reality without middle ground does not exist on this ball of mud and water we call planet Earth. Either ors are not feasible outside of the self-contained ideological system of absolute idea. But once a gullible person gets into this system, everything starts to make sense in his own mind. As we pointed out at the outset of this analysis, Dugin explicitly proposes that geopolitics should be used in this way to influence the masses, and judging by the almost complete meltdown of Western alternative media into the Neo-Eurasianist semantic system, he is absolutely right. The allure of simplistic coherence, served with cynical smirk, is something that's not so easy to resist, especially for the people who are far removed from the immediate contact with crisis zones they are observing from the safety of their couches or armchairs. The problem is that reality of history is by its nature not a coherent system, and the unity of providence it may contain, and indeed, in my opinion, does contain, is not something that can be modeled into an absolute idea or coherent system. One does not know the day and the hour. That's the whole point. And Dugin wants to bring them about on his own accord. Therefore, from the religious point of view, he really seems to be more or less an eligible tenet of the nether regions he occasionally invokes in his more occultist writings. These writings will be the subject of an addendum to this analysis. In conclusion, we can only stress once more the nature of Dugin's apocalyptic geography. It is an ideology of absolute conflict, and as such, namely being absolute, it seeks to subvert every conceivable traditional model of both politics and spirituality by dissolving it into its own image, while extracting its real essence. Discarding its real essence. This is the reason why this bearded patriarch of chaos is an acid test for people who adhere to some kind of traditionalism. The mindless clinging to Dugin as some kind of representative of tradition, Christianity, etc., clearly displays the fact that people enraptured in this enraptured by him, share his absolute superficiality. Dugin is perfectly able to coherently demonstrate that René Guénon was right, as well as at the same time proving that Karl Marx was right. He can do this because he, as a person and thus the subject of knowledge he mediates, is absolutely deprived of any substance. This is not the moral observation, it is an ontological fact, symptomatic of modern man. No matter how intelligent or erudite one can be, he can still at the same time be completely detached from the reality of what he is talking about. The only firm ground Dugin recognizes is the ground itself, the soil and its expansion. His gaze is firmly and deliberately focused downwards. That way he can take various teachings from René Guénon, Russian Orthodox dogma, to Marxism and proto-Nazism as coherent systems he can expound and manipulate. He merely takes the conceptual framework and works with it, not even minding the contradictions, because he can always pass on to the new one and still remain true to his own nihilist principle. This kind of subversion, that is, creating the simulacra of religion, metaphysics, tradition, etc., is, in my opinion, potentially far worse than anything Western ingenuity has to offer, because it is the intentional corruption of what is good, and not merely its rejection. Moreover, it is perilous for anyone coming into intellectual contact with it, because it requires emptying of one's soul of any real spiritual content in order to seamlessly interiorize the counterfeit. To put things plain and simple for aspiring traditionalists among the readers, the world of tradition sank below the horizon long time ago. This does not mean that it doesn't exist anymore. And Dugin is not trying to revive it. He's trying to erase the horizon itself. These musings lead us out of the sphere of geopolitics towards its occultist roots in the myth of Arctogea. And this story deserves to be told separately and in its own right.